On the afternoon of June 6, 1980, a 56-year-old man named Zygmunt Adamski, who just went by Ziggy, was having a late lunch with his wife and his cousin inside of Ziggy's little brick house in the English village of Tingley. That day had been a particularly stressful day for Ziggy and his family because the following day was Ziggy's goddaughter's wedding, and Ziggy was very close with his goddaughter. Ziggy and his wife couldn't have kids because of medical issues, and so his goddaughter had basically become, at least in Ziggy's mind, like his own daughter. And so in fact, at her wedding, Ziggy was going to be walking her down the aisle. And while Ziggy was really excited about this, he was also very stressed out that he was going to screw it up. And so he had gone over and over, what responsibilities he had as part of the wedding party. And he had this little speech he had to give that he had rehearsed 50 times. He had it written out. I mean, he was ready, but he was very much in his own head about something potentially going wrong that he would be responsible for. And on top of that stress, Ziggy had gotten into a fight that day with his cousin because he felt like the cousin was being kind of disrespectful in some way to his goddaughter. And so Ziggy had stepped up and defended his goddaughter to his cousin. And so there was this undercurrent of tension at the lunch table, not to mention this overarching stress that Ziggy was under about this wedding. And so as Ziggy and his cousin and his wife have this kind of tense meal, Ziggy suddenly realizes that he forgot to get potatoes when he went to the store earlier to buy ingredients for this meal. And for some reason, Ziggy decides, you know what, I'm going to just put my stuff down now, go to the store, and get those potatoes, even though at this point it was too late to make the potatoes for the meal. And so maybe Ziggy just wanted to go out and do anything to get away from his cousin for a minute and away from all this wedding planning they were doing and just kind of go out and clear his head. And so Ziggy put his napkin down on the table, he stood up, he told his cousin and wife that he was going out to get potatoes. They were like, okay, and the cousin actually said, do you want me to come with you? Is there anything else you need to get while you're out? And Ziggy said, nope, I'm good. He grabbed some cash out of his wallet and he headed out the door. The village of Tingley, where Ziggy and his wife lived, was a very safe place. He and his wife had actually moved there after fleeing from Poland during World War II, where both Ziggy and his wife, whose name was Lottie, had been held prisoner at some point. And so after all this trauma of being held prisoner and having to flee their home country, they had looked for the safest, best place to kind of resettle and stay for good, and Tingley was it, and they loved it. Ziggy had gotten a job in Tingley as a coal miner, and he had been doing that for 27 years. As for Lottie, she didn't work because she had a disease called multiple sclerosis, which meant she was confined to a wheelchair. But Ziggy and Lottie had quickly made lots of friends in town who were very supportive, and so it wasn't long before Ziggy and Lottie had a very happy and stable life in this town. The little shop where Ziggy was going to was only about 3 blocks away from his house, which meant walking to the store, getting potatoes, and coming back would only take a few minutes. And so Lottie and the cousin back home, they expected to see Ziggy really come back within 10-15 minutes. But when he didn't, and after about 30 minutes went by, Lottie actually got really concerned because Ziggy was just not the type of person to do stuff unannounced. He was incredibly methodical, he was very punctual and reliable, and so being late from this little trip to the store was just so uncharacteristic that Lottie told the cousin, hey, you go to the store and see if Ziggy is there. See what's going on here. Ziggy had worked in the coal mine for nearly 30 years, and he had some serious lung issues from breathing in all of the coal, and so Lottie was thinking, maybe he collapsed or something along the way from these breathing issues. But when the cousin got to the shop owner told the cousin that they had seen Ziggy. He had come in about 25 minutes earlier, he had bought a bag of potatoes, seemed totally normal, everything was fine, and he had left walking back in the direction of his home. And so the cousin thanked the shopkeeper and then left and began jogging back towards Ziggy's house, thinking, maybe he had just not seen him on the way, that maybe Ziggy was sitting down somewhere on this 3-block path. But the cousin got all the way home and didn't see any sign of Ziggy. And so after going back inside of the house, the cousin and Lottie talked about what they should do, and they actually went back out into the neighborhood asking around, asking neighbors and other people if they had seen Ziggy. But after a couple of hours of canvassing the neighborhood and not finding Ziggy or finding any indication of what happened to him, Lottie ended up calling the police. But the police were not inclined to launch a huge investigation for a grown man who's only been missing for a couple of hours in his neighborhood with no sign of foul play or any other sign that anything really bad had happened. And after the police began asking questions of Lottie and the neighbors about what Ziggy's life was like, they learned that recently Ziggy had been declined for an early retirement from the coal mine. Because of those breathing issues he was having, he had requested to retire now, but they said no. And so Ziggy was really upset about that. He was really stressed about this wedding of his goddaughter the next day. He had been fighting with his cousin. Also, Ziggy was basically taking care of his wife, who's in this wheelchair all the time. And so because of all these stressors in Ziggy's life, the police started to wonder if maybe it was possible that Ziggy had not been going to get potatoes, but in fact was just kind of abandoning his family. And so ultimately, on the day that Ziggy went missing, the police told Lottie and Ziggy's cousin that they should just sit tight, see if he comes back tonight, and if he doesn't, go to the wedding tomorrow, because Ziggy is so close with the goddaughter. If he's having some sort of issue right now, he's very likely to come back for something as significant as this wedding. And so Lottie and Ziggy's cousin stayed at the house all night. Ziggy did not come back. They didn't hear from him. And the next day they went to the wedding, but Ziggy didn't show up for that either, even though he's supposed to walk his goddaughter down the aisle. And so after coming back from this wedding, Lottie called the police, she called local hospitals, she talked to all of her neighbors. I mean, she really put out like an all points bulletin to everybody in the area that something terrible has happened to Ziggy and we need to find him. But despite police beginning to lean into this and her neighbors really going out in force to try to find Ziggy, no one could find him. He had just vanished. On the morning of June 11th, so 5 days after Ziggy went to get potatoes and then vanished, a man named Trevor Parker got to work at his father's coal yard in the English town of Todmorden. The coal yard was basically just this big open lot that had a chain link fence around it that butted up against some railroad tracks. And inside of this lot were just these huge mounds of coal up against the perimeter of the lot. And then also inside of the coal yard was one small office building. And so on this morning, when Trevor pulled through the gates of this coal yard, first of all, he could see the entire yard the second he went in. And as he looked out, all he noticed was the fact that everything was wet from an early morning storm. And so after just kind of surveying around the lot to make sure none of the coal got blown around from the storm, he made his way to the small office building to do some paperwork. Trevor would work inside of that office building for a while, and then around lunchtime, Trevor decided to just go and get some lunch and kind of have a nice long lunch break. And so he left, he went to the pub, he was there for a couple of hours, and then around 3:45 p.m., he came back to the coal yard, and when he went through the gates, everything looked the same, except there was this dark thing on top of one of the coal piles in the back of the yard. Now, Trevor didn't know if he had seen it when he had first arrived that morning or if it was new, but whatever it was on this pile, it immediately caught Trevor's attention. And so after parking his vehicle, Trevor began walking over to this 12-foot tall coal pile with this thing on it, and when he got about 30 feet away from it, he realized he saw someone's shoe, that this dark figure was a person, and right away Trevor started rolling his eyes because there was a group of homeless people that lived near the railroad tracks just outside of the coal yard, and it wasn't uncommon for them to get really drunk and then wander their way into the coal yard where sometimes they would fall asleep. And so Trevor's thinking, okay, clearly one of these drunk homeless people has found their way into the coal yard and they've passed out on top of this pile of coal. And so instead of going over and talking to this person directly, Trevor just turned around, went back inside of the office building, and he called for an ambulance. The ambulance arrived a few minutes later. They did not have their sirens on. They didn't come flying into the yard. This was a routine thing they were doing. They were scooping up a drunk and bringing them back to the hospital. And so when the medics got out of their ambulance and Trevor directed them over to the proper coal pile, they were just cracking jokes along the way. This was not a big deal. When the two medics got to the bottom of the coal pile, one of them began climbing up the coal to go see this drunk person and get them down. And so Trevor, as this is happening, he walked a little bit closer, and when he did, he realized that the person who had fallen asleep on the coal, they had really nice pants on, like tailored pants. They were certainly not what Trevor expected this person to be wearing. But before Trevor could even really react to the clothes this person had on, the medic who had climbed up had finally reached this person. They reached down and began trying to move the person around. And suddenly, when they had manipulated this person's body enough, the medic's facial expression completely changed. They went from somewhat routine to totally horrified, and they backed off of this person on the coals. They turned around and ran down the coal, practically falling over themselves. And when they got down there, Trevor heard the medic say to his partner, call the police right now. And Trevor said, what's going on? What did you see? And the medic, who had reacted that way, just shook his head and walked away to kind of compose himself. And so Trevor at this point was starting to get spooked himself. Clearly, whatever the medic had just seen had really shaken him up. And so Trevor just kind of stood there while the other medic ran in and called police. And then a few minutes later, a police car came flying into the coal yard, and an officer named Alan Godfrey, along with his partner, got out of the car. And right away, the medic, who had gone to the top of the pile and been freaked out by what he saw, walked over with a very ashen face, and he told Alan Godfrey that something was terribly wrong with the person on top of this pile. And so Alan, not really sure what to expect, walked over with his partner to this coal pile, and with the medics and Trevor standing back, Alan, on his own, climbed up the coal, and he looked down at this person. And what Alan saw was a man lying on his stomach wearing a beautiful three-piece brown suit. And Alan immediately noticed that there was absolutely no soot from the coal that this guy was laying on his suit, even though Alan, just to get up here, had basically covered himself in black soot. And so he was wondering, how did this guy get up here and not get covered in soot? It didn't make any sense. Also, Alan noticed that this guy's hair looked totally bizarre. It looked like someone had given him like a really bad haircut with dull scissors. Like they just grabbed tufts of his hair and kind of chopped randomly. I mean, his hair was kind of all over the place. There were bald spots. And then as Alan looked from this guy's hair down, he noticed almost hidden in his hairline was this fairly deep wound in the back of his neck that was still bleeding. But there was this weird green jelly-like substance very obviously placed over this wound. And Alan had no idea what this substance was. But as weird as all that was, that didn't explain why the first medic had basically completely panicked and run away. When Alan tried to roll this guy over onto his back to try to wake him up and see if he was okay, he rolled him over, and Alan got a look at this guy's face. And immediately Alan let go of him and kind of had to step back for a second, because the guy's face was contorted in this frozen look of absolute terror. His jaw was open so wide, it was almost like his lower jaw was dislocated, and his teeth were baring, and his eyes were bulging out of his head. And so Alan quickly realized that obviously this was not just some drunk homeless person who passed out here. This was a dead person, and whatever happened to them must have been unbelievably terrifying to leave someone looking like that in their death pose. It would turn out this deceased man in the coal yard was Ziggy Adamski. But this did not solve the mystery of what happened to Ziggy 5 days earlier. In fact, his discovery really only created more questions. This town where this coal yard was, Todmorden, was located 25 miles away from where Ziggy lived. And as far as anyone knew, Ziggy didn't know anybody in Todmorden, so there was no reason for him to be there. And number two, when he had left to go get potatoes, he had been on foot. So did he walk 25 miles to this random town? Also, assuming he did just walk to this coal yard, this coal yard is a big, wide open lot that if you were standing anywhere near it, even outside the fence, you could look in and basically see the entire place. So it just seemed really unlikely that Ziggy could just walk into this very public open space and get to the top of one of these coal piles without somebody noticing him, whether that was Trevor or one of the other employees that were there, or one of the truck drivers that were in and out of there all the time, all day, doing deliveries, or the homeless people who were near the railroad tracks, or the people who rode the trains that passed by there every single day. I mean, there are a lot of eyes on this coal yard, but nobody saw Ziggy. It was like he just kind of appeared at the top of this pile. And again, even if Ziggy had managed to slip in and sneak to the top of this pile, why didn't he have soot from the coal all over his clothes? And if maybe he had been brought there, if someone had killed him and put him on this coal pile, there's even more reason he would have soot all over him, because they would have had to drag him up to the top of the pile. And even putting all that aside, if someone really did kill Ziggy and they placed him on this pile, why? This is a very open public place. Someone is going to find him. You're going to get caught if you're the killer. And then, of course, there is the issue of what Ziggy was wearing. That brown three-piece suit he was wearing that had no soot on it, it wasn't his, and it wasn't put on right. The buttons were not lined up. It almost looked like somebody else who didn't know how to put a suit on had tried to dress Ziggy. And then Ziggy also did not have an undershirt on. It was just the jacket over his skin. And then also Ziggy had this totally bizarre haircut that looked like someone who didn't know how to give a haircut had cut his hair with scissors and said, good enough. And then, of course, you have this wound on the back of Ziggy's neck. Now, the wound itself was determined not to be fatal. It was a fairly deep cut, but it wouldn't have killed him. However, the most significant part of that wound was that green jelly that had been placed across the back of it. During Ziggy's autopsy, they were unable to figure out what this green jelly was, and they ran dozens and dozens of tests on it. And also, during the autopsy, the coroner would determine that Ziggy had actually died the same day he had been found. So he was doing something for 5 days between going missing and being on this coal pile, but nobody knows what it was. And as for his cause of death, the coroner was not entirely sure, but it did seem like he died of a heart attack. The coroner would search all of Ziggy's body for signs of some sort of fight he might have gotten into, some sort of defensive wound on his body, but there was nothing. However, the coroner did find there were very small burns on the back of his neck that were caused by acid, but it was unclear how those got there. When they inspected Ziggy's stomach, they determined that he had been eating and drinking regularly, and so he was not malnourished, he was not dehydrated. He was relatively healthy when he died. He just had this heart attack for unknown reasons, and apparently whatever gave him the heart attack scared him so badly, his face contorted in that horrible way. Ultimately, the coroner just kind of gave up and ruled that Ziggy had died of natural causes, and then the case was closed. But to this day, no one really has any idea how Ziggy went from going out to get groceries to winding up 25 miles away, dressed differently, with this haircut, with this jelly on him and acid burns, dead with this horrible look on his face on this coal pile. It doesn't make any sense. This case has become very famous because people say it is the best example of alien abduction. That Ziggy had left his house to get groceries, got abducted by aliens, and then over 5 days, these aliens did stuff to Ziggy, including cutting into his neck and dropping acid on him, and then they put that green stuff on the back of his neck. They dressed him the way they thought people dressed, in the suit, but they didn't really do it right, and then they literally just dropped him on top of this coal pile, which would explain why he didn't have soot all over him. He was dead, they dropped him, and he just landed on the top of the coal pile. And even if you think that's totally far-fetched, keep in mind, still today, we do not know what that green jelly compound was on the back of his neck. It's literally never been identified, and people have been trying to figure it out for 40 plus years. Also, it's worth noting that one of the responding police officers, Alan Godfrey, claimed to have seen a UFO within weeks of finding Ziggy Adamski. On the evening of October 28, 2012, 87-year-old Barbara Howe sat at the dinner table with a friend in her house at the Mount Pleasant Retirement Village in the small town of Monroe, Ohio. As the two women began eating, Barbara's friend had a huge smile on her face. She couldn't get over how Barbara still loved to cook and how good she was at it. At 87 years old, Barbara made it a point to stay active, and she loved cooking and having people over to her house as often as she could. And when she wasn't entertaining, she loved to drive her prized red Cadillac around town and visit the shops on Main Street. At the dinner table, Barbara broke down the latest episode of Dancing with the Stars, which she watched religiously, and then also the two women caught each other up on what was going on with their kids and their grandkids. Barbara's husband had died about 14 years earlier, and since then she'd lived on her own. But her family, especially her daughters and her granddaughter Barbie, made sure she was never by herself too often. Just then, the landline phone rang, and Barbara shook her head. People calling during dinner time was so rude, as far as she was concerned. But she excused herself from the table and walked into the bedroom to grab it. The person on the phone said they were working in the retirement village that evening to fix and update all of the residents' Lifeline medical alert systems. Lifeline was a device that allowed someone to push a single button in order to get medical help in case of an emergency. Everyone who lived at Mount Pleasant had one, and it had a piece of equipment connected to the phone line that sometimes required maintenance. Barbara thanked the Lifeline worker for letting her know, said she'd see them soon, hung up, and went back to the table. Barbara and her friend talked and ate a while longer, and then finished up their dinner. They made plans to catch up again the following week, said goodnight, and then Barbara's friend headed out. Barbara cleared the table and started cleaning up the kitchen right away. She'd been a neat freak her entire life, and she couldn't stand having any kind of mess or clutter in her house. When she was finished cleaning, she poured herself a glass of iced tea, walked into the living room, and sat down in her favorite chair. She put her drink down on a small table right by her chair, then she grabbed the remote and turned on the TV. But just as she began flipping through the channels, she heard a knock at her front door. Two days later, on the morning of October 30th, Detective Greg Myers of the Monroe Police Department took a call at his desk. The woman on the phone quickly introduced herself as Donna Wesselman, and Detective Myers thought she sounded very frantic. Donna said she had plans to meet up with her mother, Barbara Howe, later that day, but she'd been trying all morning and she couldn't get a hold of her. And this was not normal. Her mom always answered her cell phone, or at least called back within a few minutes. Donna said she talked to family and her mother's closest friends, and nobody had heard from Barbara in over a day. And her mom was 87 years old, so she was really worried that she might have fallen down in the house, gotten hurt, and now couldn't call for help. Detective Myers got Barbara's address and told Donna to meet him there. He would do a wellness check on her mother and make sure everything was okay. After Myers hung up, he headed right out to his car. As a veteran detective in a small police department, he was used to handling all kinds of cases. The Monroe PD didn't have things like missing persons or homicide divisions, so the few detectives on the force had to jump in wherever they were needed, including wellness checks like this one. As Myers drove past the town's quiet Main Street, he looked at all the old-fashioned shops that were all decorated for Halloween, and he thought it looked like something out of a classic 1950s horror movie. A few minutes later, Myers arrived at the Mount Pleasant Retirement Village, and he found Donna very anxiously waiting outside of her mother's house for him. After reassuring Donna that everything was okay, he'd go in there with her, Donna pulled out the key that she had to her mother's house, she walked up to the front door, and she opened it. The pair walked into Barbara's house, and immediately Donna called out to her mother, but there was no response. Now, at first glance, nothing looked out of place to Detective Myers. He didn't see any signs of forced entry or struggle, which made total sense, because he believed Barbara had most likely fallen or gotten hurt while she was alone at the house. Detective Myers and Donna quickly searched every room in the house, but there was no sign of Barbara anywhere. But when they came back into the TV room, Donna noticed a glass on a small table, and she pointed at it, and she had this frightened look on her face. Myers didn't understand. It was just a half-empty glass of what looked like iced tea. But Donna said her mother had to be one of the neatest people alive. She would never leave a half-empty glass on the table like that. Detective Myers glanced around the room. Other than the iced tea, he didn't see any other indications that Barbara had been home recently. So he asked Donna if her mother still drove, and she said yes, she did, all the time. Myers led Donna back outside, and as soon as she was out there, she suddenly realized something else was off. Her mother's prized red Cadillac was gone. Detective Myers quickly shifted his focus from the house to the missing car. He now worried that Barbara might have driven off the road, or maybe gotten into some kind of car accident. She could have been injured and trapped in the car somewhere for almost 2 days now. He told Donna to go home and wait for his call. In the meantime, he'd issue a BOLO, a be on the lookout call, for Barbara's red Cadillac. This would go to law enforcement departments all over the area. Myers got in his car and immediately called in the BOLO. He also reached out to the Ohio State Police because he knew his department just did not have the resources to carry out a full-scale search for Barbara. And since she'd possibly been missing now for almost 48 hours, he needed all the help he could get, and he needed it fast. Two days later, on November 1st, Detective Myers sat at his desk, desperately hoping for some kind of lead on Barbara or her missing car. He'd stayed in regular contact with local, county, and state law enforcement agencies, all of whom were aiding in the search. But so far, nobody had found anything. He had also continued to update Barbara's daughter, Donna, about the whole situation, and he'd begun receiving regular phone calls from Barbara's granddaughter, Barbie, who was a young adult. In fact, Barbie had become kind of relentless, asking for regular updates and wanting specific details of the police search. Myers knew Barbara's family was upset and panicked, of course, and they had every right to want answers from the police. But right from the get-go, something about these calls from Barbie just seemed off to him. Still, at this point, he believed Barbara most likely had gotten into a car accident, so he didn't think too much about why her granddaughter was behaving strangely. After all, stress can make people act in all kinds of different ways. At around 1 p.m. that day, Myers' phone rang, and he finally got the news he'd been waiting for. A state police helicopter had conducted an overhead search, and they had located Barbara's red Cadillac. It was in the parking lot of an apartment complex in the town next to Monroe. Detective Myers contacted the local police from that town, and then rushed out to his car and drove over to that apartment complex. When Myers arrived, he saw local police officers already on site, waiting for him. And he also saw a man wearing a dark suit getting out of what was clearly an unmarked police car. Myers stepped outside, and the man in the suit came over to him. The man introduced himself as Agent Brian White of the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and he said he was there to help. Detective Myers had been holding out hope that even if Barbara was hurt, he would still find her safe and relatively unharmed. But as he and Agent White walked towards the red car, they feared that that was not the situation. Because as soon as they got near the car, they could smell something. It was the smell of bleach. And Myers knew that, almost always, bleach was an indication that somebody had tried to cover up a crime. And as they got closer to the car, they saw the trunk was not completely closed, and clearly the bleach smell was coming out of there. And then, once the two officers were standing right behind the trunk, sort of wincing from the bleach smell, they looked down and saw very clearly there were long strands of human hair sticking out of the trunk. At this point, Myers and White put on their gloves and opened up the trunk. And what they found inside was somehow even more horrifying than what they had expected. They had already expected the worst. There was a deceased woman laying in the trunk, and they immediately identified her as Barbara Howe. Barbara was almost completely naked, chunks of her hair had been cut off, and there was a strange gray dust covering her body. And her head barely remained attached to her neck. Police immediately began searching the Cadillac and the surrounding area. But the state forensics team needed more space, and they wanted to get the car and Barbara's body into a more controlled environment. None of these small-town police departments in the area had facilities to house a car for a full forensic search. So the local fire department cleared out space at their station and let the police move the car there. Once the forensics team had the time and space to really get to work, they told Myers and White that the killer had most likely poured bleach all over Barbara's body after she was dead. But the killer had not bleached the trunk or the car. And forensics techs said that after the killer covered Barbara's body in bleach, they had most likely emptied out a vacuum cleaner on her. That's where the techs thought that strange gray dust covering her body had come from. But most importantly, they said they had found some blood in the trunk and the car, but not nearly enough to match the brutal, deep wounds on Barbara's neck. They said if that kind of attack had been delivered in the trunk or the car, they would have found far more blood than they did. So, based on this, Detective Myers and Agent White believed the murder must have taken place somewhere else. and Barbara had been dumped in her own trunk and then driven to the apartment complex. The investigators thought that the most likely site of the murder would have to have been Barbara's house, but Myers had been there for that wellness check, and he hadn't seen any blood or anything that indicated a violent attack had taken place there. That said, Myers knew he could have overlooked something while he was there. There hadn't been a reported homicide in Monroe, Ohio in almost a decade. So when Myers had gone to Barbara's house, the thought that Barbara, an 87-year-old woman who lived in an upscale retirement village, had been brutally murdered there had not really even crossed his mind, so he wasn't really looking for indications of a murder. So, Myers and Agent White gathered up a group of Monroe police officers and Ohio State troopers and went back to Barbara's house to conduct a much more thorough, full-scale search. Later that evening, now almost 4 full days after anyone had seen Barbara alive, Myers, White, and their team walked through Barbara's house, and nothing new really stood out. There still didn't appear to be any signs of forced entry or of a struggle of any kind. Detective Myers also found jewelry boxes that were filled with what looked like really expensive rings and necklaces just laying out in the open in Barbara's bedroom. And it didn't look like anyone had touched Barbara's high-end TV or any of the other electronics in the house. So it definitely did not appear like someone had come to burglarize the house. And even though Barbara's daughter had talked about how clean her mom was, a glass of iced tea on a table was not enough to prove that something bad had happened there. So Myers and White started to think that they would have to expand their search across Monroe and the nearby towns in order to find the location where Barbara had been killed. But as they were getting ready to pack up and leave Barbara's house, they both noticed something at the exact same time. The heater came on in the house, and they could feel the heat coming from the floor. This meant that there were pipes under the floor that were heating the house. And they knew there had to be a way for maintenance workers to get to those pipes if they needed repairs. So Agent White called out to the team on site and said they needed to search the house for any place that might provide access to the pipes under the floor. And within a couple of minutes, a state trooper shouted for White and Myers, and they rushed through the house and they found him inside of a utility room just off the kitchen. The trooper pointed to the floor, and Myers and White looked at each other and then bent down, because they saw a wooden panel that almost completely blended in with the floor, and they realized this was actually the entrance to a crawl space. They lifted up the wooden panel and they looked inside. And right away, both men felt a mix of excitement and horror. There, in this tiny crawl space, they saw a rug that was covered in blood, and there was blood spatter all over the floor and the sides of this crawl space. Late that night, after forensics techs had collected blood and possible DNA samples from the rug, the crawl space, and throughout the house, Myers and White laid out a plan. They knew that a group of trained law enforcement officers, including both of them, had searched this house and almost left without finding the entrance to that crawl space. So they didn't believe that Barbara's killer was just some random person who just happened to stumble upon that hidden panel in the utility room floor. Instead, they were sure that her killer must have had intimate knowledge of the layout of the house. And for Myers and White, only a limited number of people could fit the bill. Staff members and maintenance crew who worked at the retirement village, and Barbara's close friends and family. Agent White had the resources at his disposal to track down and interview everyone on staff at Mount Pleasant. So Myers, who was well respected in the local community, would handle speaking to Barbara's friends and family. And Detective Myers knew who he wanted to start with, because he lived by a simple adage when it came to police work. If there's a fire, and someone watching that fire burn wants to know all the details about how it started and how it spread, there's a good chance that person may have started the fire. And Myers thought the same went for violent crimes. And there was one person who had wanted all the details about Barbara's disappearance and the police investigation from the very beginning. Her own granddaughter, Barbie. In the days following the discovery of that crawl space, Detective Myers and his team dug deeper into Barbara's life and her relationship with her granddaughter. And what they found did not really surprise them. Barbara was loved by pretty much everyone who knew her. She was smart, funny, and always looked out for other people. But hearing things like this was pretty common for police when talking to people who had just lost their loved one. But Myers got the sense that Barbara really was this kind person who had tried to take care of other people for most of her life. However, there was something else that Myers kept hearing about Barbara. She and her late husband had apparently always been great with money. So, over the years, Barbara had become extremely wealthy. And because of the type of person she was, she wanted to take care of everyone she loved after she was gone. Which meant her kids stood to inherit sizable portions of her wealth once she passed away. And also, so did her granddaughter, Barbie. And so, armed with this information, Detective Myers brought Barbie in for an interview at the police station. Barbie sat down across from Myers at his desk, and she proved to be as talkative as she'd been every time she'd called him about the investigation. Over the course of this conversation, Barbie communicated to Myers that she loved her grandmother. But she also communicated that she was having some money issues. She told him that she really had to work hard just to pay her rent and cover her bills. Now, on the surface, that did not seem particularly strange to Myers. Barbie came off like a lot of young people do who were living on their own for the first time. But there was also something that Myers could not quite figure out. Barbie still seemed like she wanted to know everything about the investigation, and Myers honestly couldn't tell if this was because of some morbid curiosity, if it was nerves, grief, or if she really was the arsonist watching the fire she had set. So, eventually, he told Barbie that the best way she could help the investigation would be to provide a DNA sample. And Barbie said yes, of course. And so Myers had an officer swab her cheek to get the sample, and then after that, he let her go. Part of Myers didn't want to believe that someone could do something so horrific to their own grandmother. After all, Barbara hadn't just been killed, she'd been brutalized. But regardless of what he wanted to believe, and even though Barbie had cooperated, Myers still had to consider her a major suspect at this point. She had tried to inject herself into the police investigation, she had a clear financial motive, and she was young and physically capable enough to have easily overpowered her grandmother. While Detective Myers continued to focus on Barbara's friends and family, Agent White and state police methodically interviewed staff members and the maintenance crew from the Mount Pleasant Retirement Village. And they also tried to collect voluntary DNA samples from as many employees as they could. But the investigation took time. There were so many people to interview just at Mount Pleasant alone that it became clear this case would not be solved overnight. And as the weeks passed by and still they had not caught the killer, Myers and White started to realize their investigation was causing a full-on panic in the retirement community. Homicide cases were almost unheard of in Monroe, so Barbara's murder had already shocked everyone in town. But now, the people who lived at Mount Pleasant started to believe there was a killer on the loose who was specifically targeting senior citizens. And they feared that the police weren't any closer to finding this killer than they had been on day one of the investigation. As the Mount Pleasant residents made their feelings public, the pressure on the police and the company that oversaw operations at Mount Pleasant continued to mount. In order to demonstrate that they were doing everything they could to protect their residents, the company that ran the retirement village helped set up a tip line with the Monroe police, and even offered a $10,000 reward to anyone who provided information that led to an arrest. On December 7, 2012, so almost a month and a half after Barbara's murder, an officer ran into Myers' office with an excited look on his face. The officer told him there was someone on the tip line, and this guy had a bizarre story that Myers needed to hear right now. And so Myers picked up the tip line, and he heard the sound of a man who had a strong Kentucky accent. The man told Myers that he had no idea if his story would actually help the police, but something had happened over a month ago that he just couldn't shake. The man said that he lived in a small Kentucky town about 150 miles away from Monroe. And not long after Barbara Howe's murder, his brother, a man named Danny French, had come to see him. And Danny had acted really strange, almost like he was saying goodbye for the last time. Now, this conversation with his brother had been disturbing enough on its own, but it was not why this man had called the tip line. The reason he had called the tip line was there was something else about his brother that was off when he had come to say this goodbye. The man said his brother had been wearing a Mount Pleasant Retirement Village sweatshirt. Detective Myers asked the man where his brother was, because he wanted to speak to Danny right away. But the man said this is actually where things got even weirder, because soon after their conversation, his brother Danny had disappeared. Immediately following this call, Myers met with Agent White, and they reached out to local police in the Kentucky town where the caller lived. But after weeks of searching, the police couldn't find the man's missing brother, Danny French. But then, on January 18, 2013, so 2.5 months after the murder, Detective Myers got a call from the cops in Kentucky. They said they had found Danny French, and apparently he'd been living in the woods for months. Myers got in his car and sped across the state line into Kentucky to the local police station where the cops had brought Danny. Danny was big and very intimidating looking. He had long gray hair and a huge gray beard, and he certainly looked and smelled like he'd been living outdoors for months. But it wasn't really Danny's appearance that shook Myers the most. Instead, it would be what Danny talked about. When Myers asked him about Barbara Howe, Danny said he didn't know her and had nothing to do with the murder. But when Myers asked him why he'd gone to live in the woods, Danny got this glazed look in his eyes, and he started talking about how the woods were a fantasy world and a place where people transformed into different things. Myers and Danny continued talking, and basically the conversation went in all sorts of different directions, into bizarre things that at times Myers just did not understand at all. It sort of seemed like Danny was sort of unhinged. But by the end of their discussion, despite the bizarreness of what they were talking about, it was clear Danny had to know something about what happened to Barbara. Myers just knew it. So when Myers left the station, he got assurances from the local police that they would keep close tabs on Danny. Still, as strange as all this might be, there was nothing actually tying Danny directly to Barbara's murder. So Myers returned to Ohio with another potential suspect, but no evidence. This had also been the case with Barbara's granddaughter Barbie and several of the Mount Pleasant employees who Agent White had interviewed. All good suspects, but no evidence. Investigators also received DNA test results of samples taken from multiple suspects and attempted to try to match them to samples found at the crime scene. Now, these results did eliminate some suspects, but they did not conclusively point to a killer. And soon, with no new evidence coming in, the investigation started to grind to a halt. Months passed, then a year went by with very few new leads. Myers and White still believed they had a few strong suspects here, but the evidence just wasn't strong enough to make any arrests. And so Barbara's case basically went cold. Fast forward to October of 2014, 2 years after Barbara's murder. Detective Myers sat in his office at the Monroe Police Station working on a different case. Now, he'd not given up on finding Barbara's killer, and both he and Agent White had continued to follow any potential leads. But Myers still worked for a small department, and so other cases did need his attention. Just then, Myers heard someone yelling his name, and then he looked up to see an officer rushing into the office with a grin on his face, and he handed Myers a piece of paper. Myers looked at the paper and saw a bunch of dates, times, and some handwritten notes, and then he asked the officer, what is this? Why are you so excited about this? And the officer said a lead in the Barbara Howe case that Myers had asked him to pursue had paid off. And this sheet of paper was a copy of the schedule that Barbara's cleaning woman had kept. Myers looked down at the schedule, and now that he knew what it was, his eyes suddenly went wide. He told the officer to find this cleaning woman and bring her in right away. He would have to ask her some questions, but Myers was now positive that this schedule finally made it clear who killed Barbara. Based on information from Barbara's cleaning woman, DNA test results, and evidence collected over the course of the entire investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Barbara on the night of October 28th and the early morning of October 29th, 2012. The killer sat inside of their parked car, staring out at the homes that lined the quiet streets of the Mount Pleasant retirement village. The killer glanced at the clock. They knew Barbara was expecting them any minute, so it was time to move. They grabbed a stun gun sitting on the passenger seat and then stepped outside. The killer held the stun gun behind their back as they approached Barbara's house and then knocked on the door. Barbara opened the door, and the killer smiled and followed her inside. Barbara walked through the house towards her bedroom, and the killer stayed right behind her. And at some point, they raised the stun gun, pressed it to her back, and pulled the trigger. Barbara immediately felt an electric shock. She screamed, she convulsed, and fell to the floor. But to the killer's complete surprise, Barbara remained conscious, and she was trying to get back onto her feet. So the killer leapt on top of Barbara and hit her in the head, and then strangled her. Eventually, Barbara passed out. The killer stood up and picked up Barbara off the floor. She didn't weigh very much. The killer then carried her through the house into the utility room near the kitchen. They laid her on the floor, reached down, and pulled up the wood panel that hid the crawl space. Once it was open, the killer picked up Barbara and dropped her into the crawl space. And then they just stood there for a minute, thinking. After a little while, the killer simply walked out of the house, leaving the door unlocked behind them. They got in their car, drove off, and parked on a nearby street, where they could still see the Mount Pleasant retirement village. And the killer just sat there in their car and waited. Hours later, after midnight, the killer saw that almost all the lights in the retirement village had now gone off. It seemed like most residents were now asleep. So, the killer grabbed a long, sharp knife they had left on their floorboard, stepped out of their car, and quickly walked back to Barbara's house. The killer walked inside and went right to the crawl space. They looked in, and Barbara still lay there. She was unconscious, but breathing. The killer got on the floor, leaned down into the crawl space, grabbed Barbara by the hair, and slit her throat. Blood splashed onto the walls of the crawl space, but the killer didn't stop. They kept slicing and cutting Barbara's neck until they had almost decapitated her. Finally, the killer relented and stood up. They grabbed a small rug from the kitchen and slid it into the utility room. They reached down, lifted Barbara out of the crawl space, and dropped her lifeless body onto the rug. But as they did that, they realized that drool from their mouths had dripped and fallen into Barbara's hair. So they took the bloody knife and cut off that chunk of her hair. Then, for the next several minutes, the killer remained in the utility room with the body, living out their wildest and most grotesque fantasies. But at some point, the killer panicked, as if they had just realized they might be leaving traces of their own DNA on Barbara's body. So they ran to the cabinet under the kitchen sink and grabbed a bottle of bleach. Then they ran back to the rug, took off Barbara's clothes, and poured the bleach all over her. Then they grabbed a vacuum cleaner that was in the utility room, opened up the bin, and dumped the dust onto Barbara's body. Finally, the killer grabbed Barbara's keys from the kitchen counter, rolled her up in the rug, and then carried her outside. In the darkness, the killer used the keys to pop open the trunk of Barbara's Cadillac. They dumped her body inside the trunk, but kept the rug. They slammed the trunk door, not noticing part of Barbara's hair was sticking out and that the trunk did not close all the way. The killer ran back into the house, threw the bloody rug into the crawl space, and covered the space up with the wood panel. Then they ran back outside, locking the door behind them, got into Barbara's car, and drove to an apartment complex in a nearby town. Once there, they abandoned the car and walked down a dark street to a large store that was open all night. From there, they called a cab, got a ride back to a spot that was not far from where they had left their own car. They walked back to their car, got in, and then sped across the state line into Kentucky. Danny French, the huge guy with the big gray beard who lived in the woods at one point and had that totally bizarre conversation with Detective Myers, murdered Barbara Howe. It would turn out Danny had once been a maintenance worker at the Mount Pleasant retirement village, so he knew all about that crawl space. He also knew that every resident had one of those Lifeline medical emergency devices. So, on the night of the murder, he called 3 women at Mount Pleasant, posing as someone who was there to fix their lifeline devices. And Barbara was the only one who said he could come by that night to fix it. And as soon as Barbara opened up her door and let Danny into her home, he carried out his plan. From the moment Detective Myers met Danny after he'd been pulled out of the woods for his interview, he had suspected Danny was the killer. Danny told Myers the woods were his fantasy world. But the more he spoke, the more it became clear to Myers that, in reality, Danny just had a lot of fantasies, and some of them were very dark and violent. After multiple meetings over several months, Myers convinced Danny to provide a DNA sample, and it would turn out Danny's DNA matched samples found inside of Barbara's house. But there was a problem. Danny had been a maintenance worker, so he'd been in that house many times, which could explain why his DNA was there. It was not until police got in touch with Barbara's cleaning woman that they realized there was no way Danny's DNA should still be in her house, because Barbara's cleaning woman kept a detailed schedule. It had dates and times, and she liked to list all of the work she had done on those dates and times. And so police knew that Barbara's house had been cleaned thoroughly many times since Danny had stopped working at Mount Pleasant, which meant if his DNA was there now, he must have murdered Barbara. In addition to that, police found security camera footage at that store where Danny had called the cab on the night of the murder, and the cab driver was able to identify him. Danny was arrested, and he would eventually confess. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. On a blazing hot summer day in 2003, a man named Carlos Ocampo took a long drink from his water bottle. He had spent the last 4 hours digging for treasure in the Atacama Desert region of northern Chile. He was searching around an abandoned church in a ghost town called La Noria. He was looking for artifacts left behind by the mine workers of the last century. Collectors paid good money for the tools, the clothes, and the other items that were abandoned here as much as 100 years ago. Carlos was completely alone. Nothing moved except the lizards and small rodents that scurried for shade behind the rocks and piles of rubble. Between the hot wind, the silence, and the lonely rocky landscape, Carlos might as well have been walking on the surface of another planet. Carlos took a final drink from his canteen and sighed. He was out of water, and he knew it was time to call it a day. But as he turned over one last pile of dirt with a shovel, he spotted a piece of leather in the rubble. He dug it up and realized it was some kind of small pouch. When he dusted it off and reached inside of it, he pulled out this bundle of old yellowed linen. And when he unfurled the linen, he found what looked like a doll inside of the cloth. But as he looked closer, he realized it was no doll. It was this tiny human-shaped skeleton, all brown and dried out. It was completely intact, and looked like at one point it had been alive. But it was only about 6 inches long from top to toe, the length of the pen Carlos had in his pocket. As he carefully turned the skeleton over in his hands, he could see a well-defined rib cage, 2 arms and 2 legs, all held together by a complete spinal column. But it was the oversized head on the top of the body that really made Carlos feel uncomfortable. It had 2 giant eye sockets that were much larger than he had ever seen on the head of a human baby. This creature also had an enormous forehead, while its chin came to a point, giving the head an oddly triangular shape. Carlos wondered if what he was holding was even human. Usually, he didn't believe in extraterrestrials, but he couldn't help but notice that the skeleton's giant head and gaping eye sockets looked a lot like the typical depiction of a space alien. Carlos wrapped the tiny skeleton back up and carefully placed it inside of his backpack. And then he smiled, because whatever the skeleton was, he was sure it would fetch a whole lot of money. In 2012, 9 years after Carlos made the discovery in Chile, an immunologist named Dr. Grant Nash sat at a bar in Palo Alto, California, with his friend and fellow doctor Stephen Simpson. Dr. Nash finished his beer while Dr. Simpson scrolled through his phone, looking for a very specific picture. The 2 doctors liked to meet up for darts and a couple of beers on the weekends. Dr. Simpson was a bit of a space exploration geek, and he liked to update Dr. Nash on the latest NASA missions. But tonight, he wanted to talk about something else. According to Dr. Simpson, there were rumors going around that someone had discovered a fully intact alien skeleton.
Dr. Nash was skeptical, but after a moment, Dr. Simpson had found the photo he was looking for. And when Dr. Nash saw the image of a tiny humanoid skeleton with bizarre proportions, his jaw dropped. The bar they were in had gotten crowded and noisy, and so the two of them moved to a quiet corner where Dr. Nash could examine the image more closely. He quizzed his friend on the full story of the skeleton. Dr. Simpson told him that researchers were now calling the skeleton Ata, short for the Atacama region in Chile where it was found. This skeleton was so unusual that a collector in Spain had bought the specimen at first sight. Dr. Simpson said that as far as he knew, no genetic experts had been consulted to determine where the skeleton had come from. So with no hard evidence, speculation was now running wild. Was this a newly discovered species of ancient human? Or possibly, could Ata be an alien being from another galaxy? One prominent UFO expert certainly thought so. He was so intrigued with Ata that he was making a documentary about the skeleton. His name was Dr. Stephen Greer, an ER physician turned ufologist, which is someone who studies UFOs and all things extraterrestrial. Due to the skeleton's small size and peculiar shaped head, Dr. Greer seemed absolutely certain that Ata was the skeleton of an alien life form. And Dr. Nash couldn't blame him. The skeleton was so well formed, it seemed like it had to have belonged to a being who had lived at least a few years. But it was so tiny, only 6 inches long. No human that small could ever survive outside the womb. On top of that, there were other indications that Ata could be an extraterrestrial, from its elongated head to the fact that Ata had fewer ribs than a normal human. Dr. Nash wasn't ready to fully buy into the idea that Ata was an alien yet, but he did feel like there were legitimate questions that needed answers. So, the next day, Dr. Nash did a little internet sleuthing and emailed the producers of the documentary. Although he worked as an immunologist, Dr. Nash had a PhD in genetics. He offered his expertise in that field to help determine where Ata came from. And after some discussion, the producers of the documentary and the skeleton's owner agreed to let Dr. Nash try. Several weeks later, Dr. Nash waited inside of a crowded conference room right down the hall from his lab at Stanford University. The room was packed with scientists, reporters, and cameras, all there to hear the results of Dr. Nash's DNA testing of Ata's skeleton. After signing multiple confidentiality agreements with the private collector, Dr. Nash and his team had received bone marrow samples from Ata's ribs and also right upper arm bone. Once all the legal formalities were completed, the actual testing only took a few weeks. But then they kept the results quiet until now, the big reveal. The usually quiet halls of the research lab buzzed like a school cafeteria as they waited for Dr. Nash to begin. But he was waiting for his friend, Dr. Simpson. Dr. Nash wasn't about to let his friend miss out on the big test results. Finally, Dr. Simpson came through the door, and Dr. Nash walked to the podium to give his report. He told the room he had tested Ata's DNA against multiple strains of known DNA, human and animal. He revealed that he even used the DNA from his own blood as part of the control sample. He said that there were still many questions about Ata that DNA alone could not answer. But the DNA sample he analyzed had settled the biggest question on everyone's minds. And unfortunately, it was not the results everybody was hoping for. According to the data, Ata was not a space alien. She was a little human girl, with DNA from both native indigenous Chilean people as well as Europeans. That meant she had to have been born sometime after 1500, when Europeans colonized what is now South America and began reproducing with local people. Dr. Nash could feel the disappointment in the room now that he had ruled out the possibility of alien life. But he reminded everyone that there were still so many things to learn about Ata, such as why was her head so elongated and strange? Was it really possible for a human that small to survive outside the womb? And if her skeleton was so complete, well, why was she missing ribs? As everyone's murmurs of disappointment turned into a spirited discussion, Dr. Nash swore he was not going to stop digging until he figured out everything there was to learn about Ata. But to find those answers, he knew he would need to bring in some more experts. A few weeks later, Dr. Nash sat with his colleague, Dr. Ben Hoffman, watching an image of Ata's tiny skeleton rotate on a computer screen. Dr. Hoffman was an expert in hereditary bone diseases, and Dr. Nash had asked him to take a look at Ata. but his findings only led to more questions than answers. What Dr. Hoffman was telling him just didn't make any sense. According to him, Atta's bones showed signs of development that were typical of a 6-year-old human. Dr. Nash was baffled. He thought Atta might have somehow survived for maybe a short period after her birth, but how could this tiny being, no longer than a dollar bill, have lived for 6 entire years? Dr. Hoffman had to admit that he wasn't sure. He explained that there were genetic diseases that caused overdevelopment of bones, a kind of premature aging, if you will, that could have made Atta seem older than she actually was when she died. Those were the anomalies he was looking for in Atta's case. However, so far, the testing had come up empty for any of those diseases. The more they discovered about Atta, the harder it was to know what happened to her. And he didn't have any answers about the strange shape of Atta's head either. Dr. Nash realized that to learn the entire truth about Atta, he would have to go even deeper into her genes. After he finished consulting with Dr. Hoffman, Dr. Nash next convinced a renowned geneticist to undertake the tedious process of examining Atta's entire genome, which is composed of millions of tiny snippets of genetic material. This review would provide far more details about her ancestry, but it is an exceedingly slow process to do this. It would take another 5 more years for Atta's secrets to be revealed. Researchers discovered a staggering 3 million small mutations in Atta's genome when compared to an ordinary person. And at least 64 of these mutations were astonishingly rare and could have very easily combined to create Atta's strange appearance. And so, armed with this extensive genetic profile, Dr. Nash was finally ready to reveal Atta's story to the world. Atta, it was clear, had suffered extensive birth defects. The researchers found 7 specific genetic mutations that combined to give her the pointy head, wide slanted eyes, and pointed chin. She also had a serious birth defect that damaged her diaphragm, the muscle beneath the lungs that plays a crucial role in breathing. The researchers couldn't say why Atta's skeleton looked like that of a 6-year-old, but they agreed it is highly unlikely she actually lived nearly that long. Dr. Nash speculated that a genetic disease could have caused her skeleton to develop abnormally quickly while she was in the womb. He said that Atta had likely died in the womb before being delivered, which is why her skeleton was so small. Nash concluded that even if Atta lived long enough to be born alive, her lack of a proper diaphragm would have kept her from being able to eat or breathe well enough to survive. But that wasn't the only bombshell about Atta. Despite the fact that Atta looked like she had been mummified, tests showed that she was not centuries old. In fact, Atta had been born in the 1970s, less than 40 years before her skeleton was actually discovered. In other words, far from being an ancient space alien, Atta was a modern human child who had the misfortune of suffering fatal birth defects. Within days of Dr. Nash's research being published, the Chilean government came out and condemned the ethics around how the study was conducted. Although they didn't dispute Dr. Nash's findings, the Chilean government was not happy about how Atta's remains had been exhumed and taken out of the country for analysis. And not everyone accepted the American scientists' findings. A separate group from New Zealand conducted their own 2018 study that found no signs of major birth defects. They concluded that Atta was basically normal and her skeleton was at the same developmental stage as a 15-week fetus. They concluded that her head could have become disfigured during a premature birth. And yes, there are still people out there who believe Atta is an alien. As proof, they point to the initial tests that showed only 92% of Atta's DNA matched a human's. However, later tests challenged that claim. Most of the DNA that didn't seem human had simply been degraded from Atta's decades of lying out in the desert. Dr. Nash and his colleagues stood by their findings, but they agreed with their critics on one point. They agreed that Atta should be returned to her homeland so she could be properly buried. Sadly, though, it does not seem like their calls have yet been heeded. As of 2018, Atta's skeleton still remains somewhere in Spain in the possession of the collector who bought her. And now for our second story called A Good Scrub Down. On a Saturday morning in January of 2009 in Leeds, England, 29-year-old Nick Stewart put on his favorite record and filled his electric tea kettle. He'd had a long, tiring week at work, and he was ready to enjoy a nice, relaxed morning before meeting some friends for lunch. While he waited for the water to boil, he walked over to the terrarium in his kitchen to check on his pet tarantula. Nick knew the hairy spider was an unusual pet, but he'd always loved tarantulas. He spent the next few minutes watching the spider dig a burrow and line it with silk in a corner of the terrarium, and that's about the time when he noticed some grime on the inside of the glass and knew the tank was due for a cleaning. In fact, as he looked around his own place, he realized he should probably spend the morning cleaning up instead of spending it on the couch. Once his tea was ready, Nick took a sip and then began on the pile of dirty dishes in the sink. An hour later, he'd wiped down countertops, cleaned out the fridge, put away the dishes, and scrubbed down his tarantula's terrarium. The kitchen was looking good. But Nick's right eye felt weird. It was stinging. Nick went to the bathroom to get a better look in the mirror. His right eye was swollen and bloodshot. He wondered if at some point during his cleaning spree, he'd accidentally rubbed his face with a cleaning product, because his right eye was really hurting now. He turned on the faucet to scoop some water into his eye, which seemed to help a little, but the eye was still so sore. So he just went to lie down for a while, figuring that whatever was bothering him would probably clear up with some rest. A few days later, Nick sat on a doctor's examination table with his right eye clenched shut. The eye was still watery and red, and now it was sensitive to light. Even the overhead lights in his doctor's office felt too bright. The doctor told Nick to open up his right eye. Then he tried to inspect it with a pen light. But Nick flinched as soon as the doctor shone the light into his pupil. He apologized to the doctor and tried his best to force his eye open, but it was itchy and stinging, and he just couldn't do it. And so in order to keep his eye open, the doctor had to use a device called a speculum that helped push Nick's eyelids away from his eye. Nick gritted his teeth as his doctor aimed the pen light over the surface of his eye. It burned so badly that Nick could feel his tear duct welling up and water streaming down his face. The doctor finally, mercifully, clicked off his pen light, and Nick closed his right eye again, feeling instant relief. The doctor said there was some good news. Nick was actually suffering from a common condition, conjunctivitis, or pink eye. Pink eye occurs when the thin, clear membrane that covers the eye and the inside of the eyelid gets inflamed. It can be caused by bacteria or a virus, or even an allergic reaction. Either way, it explained why Nick's eye was bright pink and irritated. The doctor told him that pretty soon, his eye would actually start discharging yellow or greenish pus, but that was normal. It sounded gross to Nick, but he was relieved it was nothing more serious. The doctor prescribed an antibiotic cream for him to use around his eye. He warned Nick that he would be contagious for a few days and so should just stay home, at least until the redness cleared up. But he'd be fine soon enough and could go back to his normal routine. 3 weeks later, an ophthalmologist, or eye doctor, Dr. John Camden, stepped into an exam room to meet his new patient, a young man named Nick. Nick was sitting hunched in his chair, his right eye still red and watery. He was clearly in severe discomfort. Nick said that his right eye had been painfully inflamed for the better part of a month, ever since he cleaned his apartment one Saturday morning. He'd been using this antibiotic cream that his doctor had prescribed for pink eye, but it didn't help. His eye was still swollen and still sensitive to light, and now his vision was getting blurry too. And occasionally these black specks would appear in his vision, and sometimes the specks would look almost gray, like translucent strings floating around. Dr. Camden promised he would figure out what was going on. First, he tested Nick's visual acuity, which is the eye's ability to see fine details. And he found that the vision in Nick's right eye was significantly worse than his left, which made sense because that was the eye that was inflamed. But Dr. Camden wanted a closer look. He placed eye drops in Nick's eyes to dilate his pupils, then had Nick sit down in front of a specialized microscope that let Dr. Camden see a magnified version of Nick's eye, both inside and out. He had Nick place his head against a chin rest and forehead support, and then shone a bright light directly into Nick's eye. He knew the light was bothering Nick, so he did his best to move quickly as he focused the microscope. Dr. Camden examined the front of Nick's eyes, and right away he noticed something interesting about his right eye. The blood vessels were inflamed, with scattered white spots all around the eye. Those symptoms were consistent with a viral infection called keratoconjunctivitis, an extreme form of pink eye. And that could be a big problem for Nick. The virus that causes keratoconjunctivitis could permanently damage Nick's eye. It could also attack other parts of his body, including his respiratory tract, his gastrointestinal system, even his kidneys and urinary tract. Dr. Camden felt like he'd seen enough to make a diagnosis. But just as he was about to turn off the microscope, something else caught his attention. He told Nick to hang on for just another few seconds. There was something strange in Nick's right eye. He refocused his instrument, and then he saw what looked like a cluster of tiny spears sticking out of the surface of Nick's eyeball. He zoomed in even closer and realized these little spears looked like hair. Dr. Camden was shocked. He realized that very likely the cause behind all this discomfort were these hairs. On one hand, that was good news. It meant Nick very likely did not have a virus. But that also left Dr. Camden with two questions. Where did these hairs come from, and how much damage had they caused? He knew he would need to have a closer look. Dr. Camden gave Nick drops to fully dilate his eyes and numb the surface so that he could shine a light bright enough to see Nick's retina, all the way at the back of the eye. 20 minutes later, once Nick was ready, he put his face back onto the chin rest, and Dr. Camden turned on the lamp. As he focused the microscope on Nick's retina, he noticed two things. First, some of these tiny hairs had clearly penetrated deep into Nick's eye, passing through the cornea that protects the eyeball surface and nearly reaching his retina. The hairs were embedded so far back that Dr. Camden wasn't sure he could even remove them. Second, Nick's retina itself was irritated and inflamed, a condition called retinitis. If left untreated, retinitis could cause Nick to lose vision in that eye. Dr. Camden knew that if he wanted to save Nick's vision, he needed to get those tiny hairs out of his eye as soon as possible. And so he told Nick that he needed to figure out what they were and where they came from. He asked Nick if he had any ideas. Nick thought for a moment, and then suddenly this look of realization dawned on his face. And then he went into detail about his cleaning spree the previous month, around the time his eye first got irritated. He told the doctor that during this cleaning spree, he had noticed there was this stain on the inside of the glass terrarium that housed his pet tarantula. And while he had his hand in there cleaning the stain, his pet tarantula came running out and fired a mist of tiny hairs that hit Nick in his eyes and face. His breed of tarantula was one of many that shot these fine barbed hairs at any perceived threat as a self-defense mechanism. At the time, Nick said he didn't think much of it because he'd had tarantulas before and he'd seen them do this and it never was a big deal and he didn't feel anything. After hearing Nick's story, Dr. Camden diagnosed him with ophthalmia nodosa, a condition where the eye is damaged by insect or vegetable materials. And then he told Nick they would try their best to surgically remove the hairs. Unfortunately, though, the hairs were too small for even Dr. Camden's microforceps to grab. So he wound up prescribing steroid drops to help coax the hairs out of Nick's eye. The eye drops helped somewhat, but many of the hairs never dislodged. To this day, Nick lives with tarantula hairs buried in his right eye. They cause him mild discomfort and occasionally create floaters in his field of vision, which can appear as white spots or even sometimes cobwebs. They serve as a permanent reminder for Nick to wear safety goggles whenever he cleans his pet tarantula's tank.
But a goth is someone who finds beauty in things that most other people consider to be pretty dark. But most Americans tend to associate the term goth with the teenagers of the late 90s and early 2000s that wore all black and wore heavy black boots and would hang out in cemeteries. And while that representation of goth culture is, of course, limited, it is a good representation of the two protagonists in today's story, best friends Rachel and Molly. In the 1990s, Rachel and Molly were full-blown goths. They had black hair, black makeup, black clothes, they had the black heavy combat boots, and at one point they and their other goth friends started hanging out in a cemetery to be kind of ironic and funny, like, look at us, we're goth, we hang out in cemeteries. And then they actually enjoyed it and began hanging out in the cemetery like every weekend. One Friday night, Molly calls Rachel to go hang out in the cemetery. And as it happened, Rachel was just sitting at home and she was bored out of her mind. And so the call came at a perfect time. And so Rachel's like, yeah, I'd love to go. So she flies downstairs and she sits on her front step and she's waiting for Molly to show up. And eventually Molly's car rolls down the street and Rachel immediately recognizes that Molly is the only one in the car. And Rachel, whenever she would go to the cemetery at night with Molly, they were always there with a group of at least 4 people. Even though they liked hanging out in the cemetery, they did recognize that it was a little bit creepy at night to be out there. And so they liked kind of rolling in a fairly big group. And so Rachel hops in the car and her first question to Molly is, where is everybody? Are they meeting us there? And Molly said, oh no, everybody else is either working or they're kind of hungover from the party from last night. So it's just us two. I hope that's okay. And at the time, Rachel actually in her head was like, no, I don't really want to do this anymore. But she was like, oh yeah, that's fine. Yeah, we'll just go. Just the 2 of us. It'll be fine. Molly takes off from Rachel's house and she makes the familiar kind of winding commute to the front gate of this enormous cemetery that sits right in the center of town. They drive underneath this massive wrought iron gate that looks very medieval, very foreboding. It looks like it's out of a cheesy horror movie, this like cliche entrance to a cemetery. And so they go through there and they're on this road that stretches all the way down through the cemetery and basically splits it in 2. On the left side, as you're driving in, was an area closest to town, and also it butted up against a major public university. And then on this side of the cemetery, you had a bunch of residential houses that butted up against the side of the cemetery. And where Molly and Rachel and their crew liked to go was on the right side, all the way back in the corner, because there was a section that was kind of situated between these 2 hills, where not only were they obscured from the cemetery road and the main road once they were down in this little depression, there was also no houses that happened to look over that spot. So it was kind of like the hidden section of the cemetery, and there was also this big boulder that people sat on and a big tree you could lean up against. So that was their spot. So Molly drives in the gates, she heads down that road and she turns right onto a dead end road. She takes that down about a couple hundred meters till it dead ends, and they park. And then the girls get out of the car, they light up cigarettes, and they walk down this hill that's just beyond where this dead end comes to an end. And so they walk down this hill and it brings them to this clearing where this big rock and tree is. Rachel hops up on the rock and she turns around, so she's facing back up the hill they just walked down, and Molly is right next to her on her right, leaning up against the tree. And for the next hour or so, they just crushed cigarettes and talked about their various boyfriend drama and life drama and whatever else they wanted to talk about. After a while, the girls started to smell a bonfire. And from where they were sitting, they could see a hill in front of them, and there was actually another hill over here. And so their view is pretty obscured out of this little valley they're in, so they can't see any fires anywhere. And so they assumed that what they're smelling was a fire coming from the other side of the cemetery, because there's that huge university over there, and they knew sometimes the college kids would come onto the cemetery and they would light fires over there, and inevitably the police would get called and they would break up the fire because you're not allowed to have a fire on the cemetery. And whenever they did that, the police would actually make rounds around the entire cemetery, and historically, basically, if you were there hanging out, they would tell you to leave. And so they think, okay, this is probably a good time to leave, because probably in the next 30 minutes to an hour, the police are going to be here, they're going to come over here, see our car, and they're going to ask us what we're doing, and we're going to have to leave. So let's just leave now. So Rachel hops off the rock, and the 2 of them begin meandering their way back up the hill towards the car. When they get about halfway up the hill, they notice to their right something bright. Now, because they were higher up, they could actually see over the hill to their right. And what they were seeing was the top of a bonfire. So the girls take a couple more steps up the hill to gain some elevation to hopefully be able to see better down into where this fire is. But even when they're up almost at the top of the hill, that fire is too far down on the other side of that hill that they can't see any people, and they can't really tell how big the fire is. They're just basically seeing the top flickers of it. Even though they don't know anything about the people over there at this fire, what they do know is when they showed up, there was no fire over there. They would have recognized it. So whoever's over there had to have shown up and built this fire while Rachel and Molly were down at the rock and tree. which means there's a pretty good chance they didn't see Rachel and Molly. This is a pretty private area. Their car was parked a little bit off to the side of the trail. And so Molly picks up on this and she says to Rachel, hey, let's sneak back down and walk up their hill and look down and see who's here. I bet it's a bunch of college kids. It'll be funny to see what they're doing. But Rachel had a weird feeling about it. She's thinking to herself, if this is college kids, why would they have their bonfire this far away from campus? I mean, this is literally the farthest point away from the side of the cemetery that's close to their campus. If they're having a party over here, there's a good chance that anybody going to it is going to need to drive. And that just doesn't make sense if you can just walk to the other side of the campus and have a bonfire over there. And so Rachel is logically deducing that this is probably not college kids. But who else is having a bonfire in the secret section of the cemetery in the middle of the night? And Rachel's thinking that now if the police come here, they're definitely going to see us because we're so close to this bonfire. And so it's probably not a good idea to stick around much longer. But despite Rachel's hesitations, she is intrigued and she does want to see what's going on over there. So the two girls walk down the hill, they make it down to the rock and the tree, then they turn left and they begin walking up this other hill, the hill that's going to bring them up to this fire. And so they only get a few steps up this hill when they are suddenly hit with this disgusting, putrid smell that just encompasses them and it makes them gag, and they're covering their mouth and their nose, and Rachel exclaims, "Oh my God, what is that?" And then as soon as she says it, she realizes she was really loud, and she's like, and Molly's like, and they both freeze, wondering if the people on the other side of the hill have heard them. And after a little bit of silence, Molly's like, "You want to keep going?" And Rachel's like, "No, we gotta go." Between the horrible smell that's obviously coming from this weird fire and the fact that Rachel basically just gave them away. And so for all we know, these people on the other side of this hill have heard us and now they're waiting for us to come over the edge, and it's gonna be really awkward if we suddenly crash their bonfire. Rachel, she's thinking about these things, and so she's like, let's go, we gotta go. Molly's disappointed, but she gets it, and the two girls turn around and begin walking back. And so they walk past the tree and the rock on their left, they turn right, and they're about to walk up the hill that's gonna bring them to their car when Rachel just turns around to look at the hill towards the fire where they were headed before. And standing at the top of that hill is a man just looking down at them. And the fire is illuminating him from behind, and they can clearly tell it's a man standing there looking at them. And immediately the girls felt really uncomfortable. It was almost like they had just been caught spying, even though they didn't actually get caught spying. It was what they were gonna go do. And so they felt like they had almost been caught red-handed. And so Molly and Rachel just turn and begin walking up the hill, kind of with their heads down. They just felt kind of awkward. And so they move a few more steps up this hill, and Rachel looks again at where this guy was standing, and he's now gone. And Rachel's relieved, but then she realizes he's gone because he's walking, power walking, down the hill towards them. And Rachel gasps and she grabs Molly and pushes her and says, "Go, go, 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 go." And they start running up the hill, and Rachel looks around, and now this guy is running towards them. He's down now at the rock and the tree. He's gaining on them. They sprint up over the top. They run to Molly's car, and Molly's fumbling with her keys to get the car open, and Rachel's yelling, "Hurry up, hurry up, hurry up." Finally, she gets it open, and they both jump inside. Rachel locks the car doors, and as Molly is turning the key over, Rachel's looking out the back, and she's waiting to see this guy. And sure enough, as they pull off, she sees his head come up over the ridgeline just enough that he can clearly see them leaving, and then he ducks back down and he disappears. And the two of them speed down the road. They make a left onto that main drive, and they speed out of the cemetery. For the first few minutes of their drive, neither of them say anything. This was just a very traumatic experience, and it was also very confusing because they thought they were going over to spy on college kids having a bonfire, and then they're hit with that horrible smell. Like, what was that horrible smell? And then they leave, and there's this guy who did not look like he was a college kid. He looked like he was probably in his 40s, and then he's chasing them. You know, like, what was that? And when they did start talking about it, they couldn't really come to any sort of rational conclusion of what had just happened. And so they were both very spooked, and they decide, let's just go home and talk about this tomorrow. And so Molly drops Rachel off at her house, and Molly goes home, and both girls go to bed. The next morning, Rachel gets up and she heads down to the kitchen where her mom is already there having her morning coffee. And Rachel sits down, and, you know, she's not a big talker. She's not about to start by saying, "Hey, guess what happened to me last night at the cemetery?" Instead, she just sits there, and for a little bit, her mom just kind of rambles about work and what she's doing that day. And then all of a sudden, her mom, it's like she has this epiphany. And she goes, Rachel, did you hear what happened last night? And Rachel's like, no, what? And her mom's like, someone I work with. I don't know her personally, but she works in the same building as me. She got kidnapped from the parking garage where I parked my car. I have seen her park her car in this lot, and she got kidnapped. And Rachel's like, oh my God, really? Like, what happened to her? Did they find her? And her mom was like, yeah, but it was too late. The person who had kidnapped her had killed her and then tried to dispose of her body at the cemetery by burning her in a bonfire. Rachel suddenly felt sick because now she knew what was happening last night, and she knows what that smell was. Rachel immediately pours her heart out about everything that happened the night before, and her mom is totally horrified, but she's in particular horrified that they clearly had been there when the killer had arrived and set up shop and began burning this body. They were just literally 50 meters away the whole time. And so her mom tells her, you and Molly have to go to the police station and make a statement. They have not caught this person yet. You've seen this person, you gotta tell them. And so Rachel calls Molly and breaks the news about what was actually happening the night before and who was actually chasing them to their car, and says, we have to go to the police station. And so they agree, they go down to the police station and they tell them what happened, but they didn't get a great look at him. They could only say that he was maybe in his 40s and maybe average height. And so the police wrote it all down, but they basically said, look, if you can think of more details, we would love to hear those because this isn't really enough to go on. And so the girls go back home and they're thinking to themselves, did he see us? Does he know that we saw him? Do you think he knows that we know he's a killer now? And so they're freaking out. But luckily, within 48 hours, the police actually caught this guy because he was driving around in the murder victim's car and someone spotted him. They pulled him over and he confessed, and so he went to jail. Needless to say, Rachel and Molly thanked their lucky stars that when they started ascending that hill and they were hit with that smell, that Rachel said, let's not go any farther. Let's leave. Because had they continued and gone to the other side, they could have wound up in the bonfire too. So that's going to... In March of 2015, 22-year-old Sailor Gilliams and her good friend Brendan Vega, who was also 22, decided they wanted to go hiking. Now, they were both highly inexperienced hikers, so when they were looking in the area for places to go hiking, they were looking for novice trails, things that they would be able to manage. And they thought they had found one in Santa Barbara, California. And so they headed off in that direction and they took off on this particular trail. A little ways into their hike, and they started to feel like, man, the terrain here is pretty treacherous. This is way more difficult than we were expecting when we looked at the map. And as they continued and they're climbing over these huge boulders and it just seems totally like an advanced trail, they start to wonder, did we veer off the trail? Worried they might be lost, they turned around and began backtracking, hoping to find the trail and find some landmark that would allow them to confirm they were on the right trail. As they're backtracking, not only do they not find the trail, but they don't find any trail. They've managed to go completely off the path and are now in this kind of random boulder field that they have no idea where it is on the map. Navigating this terrain in the daytime with light would have been difficult even for an experienced hiker. But now it's nighttime, they don't have flashlights, and they're jumping boulder to boulder, and Sailor at some point loses her footing and falls and fractures her leg. Brendan rushes over and tries to help Sailor stand up, but she can't move. And so Brendan tries to put her on his shoulders and starts walking with her. And that works for a little while until they're passing by this waterfall and they fall off of it and they come careening down, they smash onto the ground, they survive the fall, but Brendan now has a broken elbow and Sailor now has a broken ankle on top of her broken leg. Sailor's in excruciating pain, and because of this fall, there's just no way Brendan's gonna be able to lift her back up and keep walking. And so the decision was made that Brendan was going to go try to find help on his own, and that she would stay here and continue to yell for help in hopes that someone might hear her before Brendan got back. He takes off, and as soon as he's around the corner and gone, Sailor begins screaming for help, and she would continue screaming for help all through the night, well into the next day. About 24 hours after Brendan had left, he still had not returned, and at this point, Sailor's in and out of consciousness. She knows that she's going downhill quickly unless someone finds her. By the following afternoon, Brendan is still not back yet. So laying face down in the mud with flies buzzing all over her head, she was helpless and trapped, and there was nothing she could do but wait until either a miracle occurred and someone found her, or most likely she just dies. So at the same time that Sailor and Brendan are going through this horrible ordeal, three totally unconnected people decide they want to blow off work and school and just go escape into nature. And so they settle on a hike that would bring them to a waterfall in Santa Barbara, California. Even though this waterfall was a popular tourist attraction, it was very difficult to get to it. It basically required 45 minutes of almost uphill climbing across boulder fields. Very dangerous, and it's not something for a novice hiker to be doing. So they reach the parking lot, they take off on this hike, and when they're just at the base of the waterfall, instead of taking the main trail up to the top, the three hikers decide, let's actually go around off the trail to this pocket of boulders over here where there's a couple freshwater pools that have formed underneath the base of the waterfall. So they leave the main trail and they're climbing over these huge boulders. It's very dangerous. And at some point, one of the hikers starts taking pictures as they're kind of going across these boulders. Through the viewfinder, as they're taking pictures, they notice something out of the corner of their eye that's in frame. It was like this red flash of something. And so the hiker puts their camera down and she looks down where she sees this red, and she can tell right away that it's someone's hair. It's a girl's dyed red hair. And it was Sailor. The hikers went down to Sailor and they called 911, and they came in, they airlifted her out of there, and Sailor would actually make a full recovery. Unfortunately, Sailor's friend Brendan did not make it. They found his body about 100 meters away from where she had been laying. After the ordeal, the woman who was taking those pictures and had spotted Sailor out of the corner of her eye, she went to her camera and was flicking through some of the pictures she had taken during the hike. She had inadvertently taken a picture of Sailor before they had found her. So had it not been for these hikers being where they were and taking those pictures and noticing her red hair, this picture almost certainly would have become the last picture of Sailor Gilliam's alive. Jolie Callan was this little 4'10", 18-year-old girl from Alabama who, despite her tiny stature, had a huge personality and was incredibly popular. Everybody seemed to love this girl. In 2015, Jolie had just graduated high school and was planning to move away from her town and go to college outside of Alabama, and she was really excited about it. But she had a bit of a problem because she had this boyfriend named Lauren Brunner who she had repeatedly tried to end the relationship with because he was so possessive, but she hadn't been able to successfully break up with him yet. Every time she tried to, he would threaten that he was going to hurt himself or that he was going to hurt her if she ever left him, and so she never quite followed through. But with college on the horizon and to her what felt like this fresh start once she left Alabama, she finally pulled the plug on her relationship with Lauren and made it very clear that they are done. And she was firm on that decision even when Lauren did start lashing out and yelling at her and pleading with her and doing everything he could to win back her affection, but it just wasn't going to work because she had moved on. For weeks, Lauren was trying to convince Jolie to change her mind, but again, Jolie just stayed firm on her decision. And after quite some time, it seemed like Lauren had finally got the message because his messages and cries for her to change her mind had stopped, and there was finally a little bit of distance between the two of them. On August 29th, 2015, Lauren would break that silence and would reach out to Jolie and ask her if she wanted to go for a hike with him, simply as friends. Jolie was naturally hesitant about this, worrying that, this hike as friends could very quickly turn into something more that she didn't want, but she did want to remain friends with Lauren. He was very important to her, and so she reluctantly agrees to go on this hike. After Jolie responded to Lauren that she was willing to go, Lauren was really excited. And so he posted on Instagram this picture of himself looking, I guess, excited. It's hard to tell from the image, but the caption basically said that he was excited about going on this hike with her and that things were, quote, looking up. At the same time, after Jolie had given that answer to Lauren, after she had agreed, yes, I'll go hiking with you, she texted her friend jokingly, if something happens to me, you'll know who I was with. The next day, on August 30th, Lauren picks up Jolie and he begins documenting their trip on his Instagram page. Jolie gets in the car and he takes a picture of her and he captions it, "On our way to go hiking." The second image that he uploads is of Jolie walking her dog Kiba in a parking lot. It appears that this lot is at the base of the hike they're about to go on. The third image shows Jolie standing on a rock overlooking this forest, and she's holding her dog Kiba. And it's clear, based on this picture, that now they've actually begun the ascent up this trail. The fourth and final picture that was uploaded to his Instagram page shows Jolie standing on a rocky cliff, and she's holding her own camera up and she's taking pictures out over this valley. And the picture was captioned, "Jolie the photographer." Immediately after this picture was taken, Lauren would shoot Jolie twice and push her off of that cliff. He was sentenced to 52 years in jail and bragged to the inmates he was with that if he couldn't have her, no one could. In November of 1961, a wealthy doctor named Arthur Duperrault chartered a luxury yacht called the Bluebell to take he and his family from Fort Lauderdale, Florida to the Bahamas. Along with his family, which was Jean, his wife, his oldest son Brian, who was 14, Terry Jo, who was 11, and Renee, who was 7, Arthur also brought along Julian Harvey, who was a close friend of his that he had hired to be the captain of the ship. And Julian was going to bring along his wife, who was named Mary Dean. And so on November 8th, 1961, the Duperraults and the Harveys set sail on the Bluebell, and by all accounts, their trip was going extremely well. But on the 5th night of the cruise, Terry Jo was down in the sleeping quarters of the Bluebell when she woke up to the sound of stamping sounds and screaming coming from above. She was so scared about what could be going on up there that at first she didn't do anything. But eventually she summoned the courage, got out of her bunk, and she kind of slowly made her way up the stairs and poked her head out onto the deck. And immediately she sees that her family is lying on the ground. They're all deceased. As Terry Jo is frozen in terror, Julian Harvey comes running up to her and tells her to go back down into the sleeping quarters. And so, not knowing any better, she just turns around and runs back down to her bunk. But as she's sitting there, she sees that water is flooding into the Bluebell. She can't stay down here or she's going to drown. So Terry Jo goes back up the steps, she goes onto the main deck, and she sees Julian Harvey, who's standing over the edge of the boat. And she yells to him and says, "Are we sinking?" And he looks at her and he just says, "Yes." And then he promptly jumps over the railing and swims to the lifeboat that had detached from the Bluebell and was drifting away. He climbs onto it and takes off, abandoning her on this sinking ship. Unbeknownst to Terry Jo, was the reason the Bluebell was sinking in the first place was because of Julian Harvey. When he was hired to be the captain of the ship, he used this as an opportunity to bring his new wife out with him and then kill her and collect on her insurance policy. Because in her life insurance policy, there was a clause where he would get double the amount of money if she died in the case of a freak accident. But it's speculated that while he was attacking her, one of the Duperraults had seen him doing it, and so in order to cover his tracks, he had turned on the Duperrault family. And so while it's not entirely clear why he didn't just finish the job with Terry Jo, it seems like when he jumped over the railing and took off with the lifeboat, he must have assumed that Terry Jo was going to sink with the rest of the family, and then there would be no more evidence, no more witnesses. So 11-year-old Terry Jo, as she's standing on this sinking ship, she snaps into action. She remembers seeing a cork float that was pinned up against one of the walls of the ship, and she runs over and she undoes it, she puts it on the water, she climbs on top of it just as the Bluebell sinks under the surface of the water and disappears. And so now she's just stranded out in the middle of the ocean. She's got no food, no water, no shelter from the sun on this little dinky cork float. Over the next couple of days, as she drifted along aimlessly in the ocean, her cork float would begin to disintegrate, and she would have to start positioning her body on the float so there wasn't much weight on it because it was basically beginning to sink. And the only position she could find that worked was by dangling her feet in the water. So she's half on this cork float, half of her body is in the water. And so what began happening is parrotfish began swimming up and biting her toes, her feet, and her legs, but she couldn't do anything about it. She couldn't put her legs on the corkboard or it would sink. After 2 days of balancing precariously on this cork float, the parrotfish disappeared and a bunch of dolphins surrounded her. And later she would go on to say that this was the only part of this horrible ordeal where she felt some sort of comfort. These dolphins just swam around her and almost formed a protective barrier around her that kept the parrotfish away and kept other predators away from her. On November 16th, 1961, 84 hours after the Bluebell had sunk, a Greek freighter actually spotted Terry Jo. Amidst all the whitecaps, they were able to see this little girl on a float, and they drove over, and there she was. And initially, when they went down to try to get her, there was so many sharks swimming around her that they had to be very careful that they didn't accidentally knock her into the water where she might be eaten by sharks. But eventually they were able to get Terry Jo into their basket and pulled her up onto the ship, and she would make a full recovery. As for Julian Harvey, he had made it back to shore and had told authorities that the Bluebell had caught on fire and that everyone had drowned except for him. He had done his best to save them, but he was the only one who could get out. And as luck would have it, he was literally in a police station giving information about what happened when the police were informed that Terry Jo had survived. And the police, they turned to Julian and they say, Terry Jo survived. She's in the hospital. She's going to make a recovery. And Julian was said to have gone totally ashen in the face and then kind of composed himself and said, "Why, that's wonderful." Julian quickly excused himself and fled to a Miami hotel, and the next day he was found dead in his hotel room. This is the picture of Terry Jo that was taken by one of the Greek sailors right when they pulled up alongside her before they pulled her onto their ship. This image would soon appear in publications all over the world. Despite Terry Jo's horrifying ordeal, she would go on to live a very normal life and would have 6 children of her own. So that's gonna... In 2009, Rebecca Aylward was a 14-year-old girl living near Bridgend, Wales. She was very close with her mother and her younger siblings. She was a model student, and she was well-liked amongst her peers. That year, she began spending more and more time with a boy in her grade, 14-year-old Josh Davies, who, like her, was a model student and had many friends. In October of that year, Rebecca's mother asked her if Josh was her boyfriend, and she said yes. Even though she knew her daughter was a bit young to be in a serious relationship, she'd spent enough time around Josh to form a very high opinion of him. He was incredibly kind and generous and protective of Rebecca, and so she was happy for the two of them. In January of the following year, Josh was allowed to stay over for the weekend at Rebecca's house, and Rebecca's mother remembers the two of them having such a good time together, goofing around with Rebecca's younger siblings and painting each other's nails. When Josh left at the end of that weekend, he told Rebecca that it had been the best weekend of his life. After he left, Rebecca couldn't stop smiling. She was in love. But later that day, Rebecca received a very surprising text message from Josh. He told her he didn't want to be in a relationship with her anymore. Rebecca was crushed, and she tried to get an answer out of Josh as to why he wanted to break it off, but he didn't give her one, and instead he began spreading horrible rumors about her at school, and then he went around to all of her friends and told them what a horrible person she was. And so for the rest of that school year, that's how it went. Josh just continued to mercilessly bully Rebecca for no reason. And then behind closed doors, Josh would tell his friends that he not only hated Rebecca, that he wanted to kill Rebecca. But none of his friends took it seriously. In fact, one of his friends even told Josh that if he ever killed Rebecca, he would buy him breakfast. Fast forward to the end of 2010 when the next school year began, and Josh's behavior completely changed. Suddenly, he was being nice and caring to Rebecca and showing a genuine interest in her, and Rebecca, even though this guy had abused her for the past better part of a year, she secretly still loved him, and so before long, she allowed him back into her life. About a month later, on the evening of October 22nd, Josh sent Rebecca a Facebook message asking her if she would meet him the following day in the woods near their home. This was a popular hangout spot for teens, and so to Rebecca, this constituted a date. This would be the first official date since their breakup nearly a year ago, and so Rebecca was excited and told him, sure, I'd love to go. And so the next day, Rebecca got up early to put on her makeup and to get ready and get dressed, and then after she was all dolled up, she said bye to her mom and she headed out to meet up with Josh. Shortly after she left, Rebecca's mom got a bad feeling about this meetup, and so she called her daughter and said, hey, stay on the phone with me until you see Josh. And so the two of them chatted until Rebecca made her way to the edge of the woods, and then she says to her mom, oh, I can see Josh, he's walking towards me, everything is totally fine, I love you and I'll see you later. After she hung up the phone, Joshua walked up to her, said hello, took her hand, and then walked her back into the woods. That morning, Josh had changed his profile picture on Facebook to be an image of the woods where they were having this meeting. And then also that morning, Josh had texted one of his friends and said, you'll be owing me that breakfast soon. And so Josh led Rebecca for quite a while deep into the woods until he came to a stop. And while they were stopped, Rebecca at some point turned to look at something, and with her back to Josh, Josh reached down, grabbed a very heavy rock, and proceeded to beat her to death. Afterwards, Josh called his friends to see what they were up to, and they asked him if he was still with Rebecca. And so Josh is standing over this poor girl's lifeless body, and he says to them, Define with. Later that day, Josh brought his best friend into the woods and showed him Rebecca's body. And then less than 24 hours later, that friend would tell police what Josh had done. During Josh's trial, he was completely unfazed, completely emotionless, and was seen smiling for much of it. He said he didn't kill Rebecca, and in fact, he tried to place the blame on his best friend, but the jury saw through it, they found him guilty, and he was ultimately sentenced to 14 years in prison. To this day, no one knows for sure why Josh killed Rebecca. The only concrete motive anybody can point to is that one of Josh's friends offered him breakfast if he went through with the killing. Here is a photo of Josh with Rebecca shortly before he killed her. At the start of World War II in 1939, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia did its best to stay neutral and out of the war. But on March 25th, 1941, they finally caved to Nazi pressure and signed a treaty that aligned them with the Nazis. 2 days later, Yugoslavian military leaders who were unhappy with this treaty overthrew their government and installed a new king in hopes he would be able to keep their country out of the war. But upon learning of this coup, Hitler issued a directive that classified this new Yugoslavian government as hostile and ordered its invasion. 10 days later, on April 6th, the Nazis invaded Yugoslavia, and then 11 days after that, Yugoslavia surrendered. But despite their speedy victory, the Nazis struggled to maintain control of the country because of local resistance groups that fought them at every turn. One of the primary resistance groups was called the Partisans. 3 months after the Nazis' invasion, a 15-year-old girl named Lipa Radic and her family, who all lived in Yugoslavia, were arrested by the Nazis. 3 of the men in Lipa's family were members of the Partisans and so had attracted Nazi attention. 20 days later, as the family still sat in jail wondering what the Nazis were going to do to them, undercover partisans broke into the prison and freed them. After getting back home, Lipa, who was totally inspired by the bravery of these partisan warriors, she immediately joined their group. As a partisan, Lipa would serve as a nurse on the front lines, treating and evacuating the wounded, and then at night she would participate in direct combat against the Nazis. By 1943, when Lipa was just 17 years old, she had become a very hardened warrior. In February of that year, Lipa was leading a rescue effort of all these women and children, and she was walking them up a mountainside to a partisan camp when the Nazis came out of nowhere and surrounded them on all 4 sides. And Lipa, who refused to surrender, expended all of her ammunition defending these women and children until she was eventually captured. The Nazis moved Lipa to a nearby village where they viciously interrogated her, demanding that she give up the names and locations of her partisan comrades, but Lipa refused. After 3 more days of unsuccessfully trying to get Lipa to give up information, the Nazis grew frustrated and sentenced her to death. And so later that day, Lipa was marched out to a tree situated next to a train station, and hanging down from one of the branches was a noose, and under the noose was a table. With her hands tied behind her back and only wool socks on her feet, the 17-year-old girl calmly climbed up onto the table and stared down at the crowd. As the noose was being tied around her neck, the Nazi commander gave Lipa one more chance to give up information about her partisan comrades, and if she did that, they would spare her life. The Nazis had brought out a cameraman to document this execution because their plan was they would distribute the pictures all over the country to scare the partisans into submission, that this is what happens if we catch partisans. And so with the cameras flashing away, Lipa famously turned to face this Nazi commander and glared at him and said, "Those who you're asking about will reveal themselves when they wipe out all of you evildoers to the last man." After this, Lipa was hanged. The pictures of her execution were indeed distributed all around the country, but there was no context or story. It was just some partisan being executed by the Nazis. But eventually, Lipa's story about her defiance and her famous last words found their way into the partisan camp, and suddenly those images of her execution took on brand new meaning. They no longer inspired fear like the Nazis were hoping. They inspired courage and pride and a will to keep fighting. When the Nazis discovered this is what that picture now represented, they tried to destroy all of these pictures, but it was too late. Lipa had already become a national hero. Following her death, the partisans continued to fight the Nazis and eventually helped to defeat them. After the war was over, the partisans were recognized as one of the most effective guerrilla forces in the entire war. On December 20th, 1951, 1991, Lipa was posthumously awarded the second highest military award in Yugoslavia, called the Order of the National Hero. Here is the photo of Lipa glaring at that Nazi commander after she's just told him her comrades are going to kill him. In 2017, Steven Weber was a larger-than-life 38-year-old DJ living in Louisiana. That year, through a mutual friend, he met Kenesha Antoine, who was a 38-year-old lawyer also living in Louisiana. And as soon as they met, they immediately hit it off and began dating. They both had always wanted to travel the world, but they never got around to it because life always seemed to get in the way. But now that they had each other, and so therefore had travel partners, they decided they couldn't wait any longer, and so they created a bucket list of all the places in the world they wanted to go. And then over the next couple of years, they began checking places off their list. In 2019, when Kenesha was going to turn 40, they decided they needed to go somewhere really special to celebrate. And so they checked their bucket list to see where they hadn't gone yet, and they ultimately settled on going to East Africa because there was a resort there they had always wanted to stay in. It was called the Pemba Resort, and it was famous for their underwater room. They literally have a 2-story cabin floating 300 meters off the coast. Its main floor is at surface level. It's got a beautiful couch that looks out over the water, and you can take the stairs up to the roof of the main floor where there's another couch and you can stargaze and look out 360 degrees, and there's no other cabins out on the water. You're completely isolated. And then if you go back down to the main floor, there is a ladder that goes straight down 10 meters into the master bedroom, and it's completely underwater. All 4 walls have these huge windows that look out directly into the beautiful Indian Ocean. To stay in this cabin for one night costs $1,700, and so Steven and Kenesha decided they would only splurge on it for one night at the end of their Africa trip. So in September of that year, the couple flew out to Africa, and for over a week, they enjoyed sightseeing and going on safaris and eating nice food, and then at the end of their trip, it was time to head out to the underwater room. So they got to the Pemba Resort on the mainland, they checked in, and then they loaded into a boat and were brought out 300 meters to their actual cabin out on the water. And then after the boat left them there, Kenesha got out her phone and began filming. And she filmed as the two walked around and they looked at the amazing view. They went onto the roof and they're looking all around and they're laughing because it's so unbelievably beautiful. And then at some point they make their way down that ladder down into the master bedroom underwater. And the two just can't stop laughing because it was so bizarre and just so incredible being down there. There were fish that were coming up to the glass and just staring at them. They just couldn't believe what they were seeing. And then at some point Steven makes a joke that a shark was coming, and Kenesha turns around and then sarcastically laughs at him and says, "Oh, okay, haha, yeah, a shark," and then she turns off the recording. A little while later, Steven leaves Kenesha in the master bedroom and he goes upstairs and he puts on fins and then hops in the water. Kenesha, who's still down in the master bedroom, is surprised when she sees her boyfriend on the other side of the glass out in the Indian Ocean. And so Kenesha just grabs her phone and starts filming him because she knows he's up to something. And then at some point, Steven pulls out a plastic bag with a handwritten note inside of it and he presses it up against the glass so she can see what it says. And so Kenesha zooms in on the note, and you can tell from the tone in her voice, she really doesn't know what he's doing, but then there's a pause in the video as she's reading the note. And the note says, "I can't hold my breath long enough to tell you everything I love about you, but everything I love about you, I love more and more every day. Will you please be my wife? Marry me." Kenesha is so astounded at this proposal. You can tell she's almost crying. She's so excited. And so as she just continues to film him, Steven pulls out a ring and he holds it up to the glass. And now at this point, Kenesha is just beside herself. She couldn't be happier. And so Steven closes the ring box, he grabs the letter, and he swims up out of view back to the surface. And Kenesha turns off the recording, turns around, runs to the ladder, and climbs up to the main floor to give Steven her answer that yes, she would marry him. But when she got up there, she looked around and Steven wasn't up there. And so she's yelling for him, she's looking around, waiting for him to show up, but he's not. And so she runs up onto the roof of the main structure to get a better look around to see where he went. But when she got up there, she looked down and there's nothing but ocean. There's no sign of Steven anywhere. And so starting to panic, she runs back down to the main floor at surface level, and now she's frantically yelling for Steven, yelling for him to come up to the surface. Where is he? Where are you? But there's no response. Kenesha is all alone out in this cabin in the middle of the ocean. She has no way to contact anyone on the mainland, and so she has no idea what to do. She doesn't know if she should just jump in the water to go looking for him. She doesn't know if he's maybe playing a joke on her. She just doesn't know what's happening. And so she just reflexively begins screaming out for help, hoping that somebody will hear her and come help her find Stephen. And after a little while, some boaters not too far away hear her yelling out for help. They come over and they, along with Kenesha, begin looking, and they ultimately find Stephen. But by the time they found him, it was too late. He had drowned. The details of exactly how he managed to drown or exactly where he was when they found him are not listed online. Here are the final photos of Stephen Weber.
Broadcast channel still on. Blue lights glow inside the control room. Data streams run quietly by. The city sleeps inside of emotion. Only signals keep me alive. Screens are breathing in soft flickers. A strange line just appeared tonight. No one speaks it out in words yet, but the air's changed. It's like 1 second feels like it's stretched. Crimson petals awake the cries of my babies. My waking mind can understand who suffers love to feed their young. A new vision of hereafter where I can be both held and whole. Looking to me with white sun moon eyes, whispering, my love, your time's come. I've searched through rain and starless skies and broken lives, dreaming you. There is a war that rages on all sides, a war inside of you. You're caught raging. Burn until they're dying. They are little poochies. He'll have his halo in the sky. The Satsuki upper fits them all. Family and friends will bury him. My little champion, better Jordan, will cover him with the colors of the East. As she tackles truly the best of mankind, dreaming in the bamboo grove, trampling on water.
So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please hold the door for the like button, but open it way too early, so the like button has to do a long walk run up to the door just to be polite. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen.